Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. I'm excited to introduce this topic, connecting with your highest priorities and values in a time of COVID-19. It's a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and I think especially important right now. I first became interested in the idea of having clarity around priorities and values when I was working with cardiac rehab and cancer patients as the director of health psychology at CPMC. I noticed at that time that some of our medical patients who were confronted with life-threatening or terminal illnesses became suddenly crystal clear about their priorities and what mattered to them in life, sometimes for the first time ever. And my students and I at the time observed that this kind of clarity that they were experiencing often led them to experience surprising levels of contentment and even joy alongside the grief and the loss that they were dealing with. So since then, I've been researching and writing about how we can achieve that same sense of clarity and connection to ourselves without having to experience a life-threatening event. And as it turns out, a big part of how we do that is by becoming more familiar with our values and our priorities. So I love this quote: "Peace of mind comes when your life is in harmony with your true principles and values and no other way." So my goal for today is to give you some simple strategies that will hopefully lead you to some more clarity and ultimately some more peace of mind. And in order to do that, we're going to focus on three things today: clarifying your core priorities, your core values, determining your true priorities, and then practicing behavioral alignment with both of them. And before we dive into those, I want to start by just asking a question, kind of an obvious question: why, with everything else going on in the world right now, do we need to take time, precious time out to contemplate our values and our priorities? Well, first and foremost, I think because many of us are completely overwhelmed. And values and priorities can really help us manage that overwhelm. I had the opportunity to speak with some Palo Alto University students and faculty about what exactly they're dealing with, in particular, related to this time of the pandemic. And they spoke about things like financial worries and worries about housing or rent concerns, daily screen fatigue, COVID health concerns, both personally and related to family members. Lack of privacy or quiet time to get schoolwork done was an issue, and lack of adequate supplies and rising costs of everything. In some cases, personal safety was even a concern. People spoke to me about dealing with behavioral challenges with the kids or learning disabilities, in the context of online schooling, or feeling anxiety related to their own experience of virtual learning. Many people had worries about graduation, and I heard a ton about the stress of homeschooling and how that has just upended life for families with young children. And then, of course, there's the uptick in online gaming that's going on for kids. And many folks were worried about getting clinical hours and enough of them, and whether they might have to go back to the sites. So that, all in all, along with everything else, is just an overwhelming list for sure. Another reason that values and priorities matter right now is that we're being forced to make tough decisions every day, because many of our primary areas of our lives are simultaneously being threatened. That list I just showed you, normally we're dealing with things like that occasionally or sequentially, but right now we're dealing with everything all at once. And when that happens, our default tends to be that we focus on only what's right in front of us, or the most pressing, or we end up just playing like that whack-a-mole game all day long. And this is just something that people tend to do in general, but it's especially the case when we're feeling stressed or overwhelmed. And lastly, our values and priorities hold the possibility of providing us with some much needed relief right now. It's a tremendous relief when you can have the confidence in knowing that you're being true to yourself and taking care of what matters. When you know that you're taking care of the important stuff, it's easier to let the other stuff go. So let's turn for a second to what the research says. The researchers have demonstrated that when people have a clear sense of their core values, it's easier to make big life decisions, and they're less likely to engage in destructive thought patterns, especially in difficult life situations. And they have greater self-discipline and self-motivation. Social connections are stronger. And I think of particular interest for students, they have improved education outcomes, including GPA, in both college and youth. So those are a lot of great potential benefits. And it's interesting to me how each and every one of those benefits is really relevant right now to all of us in this collective experience that we're having. In our research lab, we consider clarity about values and priorities to be part of a larger construct that we call SelfConnection. And we're also finding some very exciting evidence that suggests that being more connected to ourselves leads to more sustainable and robust experiences of well-being. I'll come back to the sustainable piece in a minute, but in terms of well-being, we found that self-connection relates to the following outcomes across 3 different studies. More meaning in life, more positive mood and life satisfaction, a sense of flourishing, along with less anxiety and depression, and many other things. But those are the main things that all would really matter, I think, a lot to us right now. So now to get back to the idea of sustainable well-being. We've recently had a really exciting finding in our lab. Past research has shown that positive affect has a strong relationship with meaning in life, and meaning in life being a common indicator of well-being. So put another way, we're more likely to experience our lives as more meaningful when we're in a good mood, and vice versa. But the problem with that is that moods are inherently unstable. So we found, and this is the exciting part, that self-connection actually mediated the relationship between positive affect and meaning. So in other words, our findings in an initial pilot study and then later on in a follow-up study suggest that having greater self-connection led people to be more consistently aware of the meaning in their life without having to rely on being in a positive mood, which translates to potentially a more stable pathway to well-being. So since our research is based on, we're kind of looking through this lens of self-connection, let's go ahead and define it really quickly. Self-connection is comprised of 3 things. First, you have self-awareness, meaning you have a good knowledge of who you are and what your priorities and values are. And second, you accept your sense of yourself and you embrace those values and priorities. And third, that your daily behaviors and choices are aligned with your beliefs and your values and your principles. So as you can see, it really all starts with values. So let's talk about how we can clarify them. But before we clarify them, just to the risk of restating the obvious, I want to take a second and just talk about the difference between values, principles, priorities, and goals. So first, values are how you see the world and what you see as important. Since they often strongly influence attitudes and behaviors, they serve as kind of a personal compass. Values answer the question, what do you stand for? And what do you believe in above all else? Values tend to be enduring and they don't change much, but they can change over time, so it's important to revisit them every so often. Principles and beliefs, on the other hand, are the rules that govern the behavior that we live out. They're based on a person's values. So for instance, if integrity or truth are part of your values, then you may live by the principle that honesty is the best policy. Priorities, on the other hand, are simply just a ranking mechanism that help us narrow in on and select the appropriate goals for ourselves. You can't really do a good job of deciding what your priorities are without first knowing your values. So, unlike values, though, priorities can and often do change due to external circumstances like a global pandemic. And lastly, goals are simply just targets and the specific ways that we exercise our values. So, the main takeaway here is that values are the foundation for everything else. So, let's dive into identifying what your top values are. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to write down your top 3 values. But first, let me just share a few thoughts that may help you. As a society, we constantly talk about our values and we refer to them in this abstract way. But I find that in my work with clients or research participants or even friends, that most people draw a blank when I ask them what they would say their top few values are. We just generally don't have that knowledge of ourselves at our fingertips, which is totally understandable. Like, rarely do people take the time as adults or at any point in their lives to inventory their values and try to work to discern which ones truly matter to them versus which ones are outdated or have been handed down from another generation. So I'm going to ask you right now to take a few moments and write down what you think your most cherished 3 values in life are. And don't stress about getting it right or getting the phrasing right. Just put down whatever comes to mind. This is just to get you started, and you can always add to it or change it later. So here's a list of common values that might be helpful as inspiration. Go ahead and just take a minute and see if you can write down your 3 core values, and I'll do it with you. Okay, so I know that was quick, but hopefully you got at least 1 or 2 things down, and maybe a third will occur to you later. And just to mention, by the way, if of all the things that we talk about today, if this is the only thing that you take away, I'll be thrilled. Because in my opinion, writing down your top 3 values and knowing what they are is absolutely the most important thing. I can't tell you how many times I've found myself having to make a big decision and found unexpected guidance from reviewing my top list of values. So obviously this was just a quick exercise to plant the seed in your mind. And in order to really get a full understanding of your values, you'll want to engage in a deeper inquiry and set aside some time for real self-reflection. So what I want to do now is guide you through a bit of a funnel approach on how to drill down on those values so that when you decide to take the plunge on your own time, you'll know how to do it. So I find it's really helpful to look at one of those long list of values that there's several wonderful ones that you can find on the internet, and I'm happy to share them with you. They're usually in alphabetical order and they're listed in columns. Any of them will be fine. They're usually like a good one would be around like 200 values, 200 to 300. And what you want to do is start by just circling all the values that speak to you, as many as you want. And if you don't see ones that you're looking for, just go ahead and add them in. And after you do that part, then what you want to do next is narrow them down to around 20 or so of the ones that you noted are truly the most important to you. And then after that, you want to, it starts to get a little bit hard to condense them. So what helps is you want to look for common themes that you can condense under one heading. Like, for instance, things like kindness or caring or compassion, they might all fall under love for you. So then continue to narrow until you eventually draw out your top 3. And at that point, I would make sure to go ahead and write them down. And while you're at it, go ahead and write down those 10 or 15 or 20, whatever they were, that larger list as well, because that's solid gold information. And you want to keep that somewhere semi-permanent, like in a journal. You don't want that to just exist on a piece of paper that might get lost. And we'll come back to this later, but the hard part is really, being able to recall this when you need it. So those top 3, I would recommend memorizing them and knowing them cold, and maybe even like putting them on your smartphone in the notes section, because half the battle is really being able to have them at your fingertips, like I talked about. It's one thing to write them all down, but I find that the big disconnect is just remembering what they were. So if you have them somewhere, you're halfway there. All right, so doing this exercise, collecting and examining and reflecting on all of your values in this really holistic fashion is a nice turbocharged way to quickly get acquainted with yourself. And it's something that you can use to refer to over and over. It's actually really a satisfying exercise. For me, this exercise was actually life-changing. When I first did this exercise several years ago, the 3 things that I came up with were authentic connection, truth, and freedom. And I was surprised to find freedom in my top 3. And after I reflected on it a bit, I realized that there were little to no degrees of freedom in my life at the time as I had constructed it. And then, interestingly enough, about 6 to 9 months later, we had sold our house and our car. And I was on a flight to go spend a year abroad with my family in Bali with only 1 suitcase each. And lo and behold, that year was the most freeing, life-altering experience that I've ever had. And I'm not entirely sure that I would have gotten there if I hadn't uncovered that long-lost value. So once you've got your values reasonably narrowed down, then it's time to look at figuring out your priorities. And just a reminder here that priorities are informed by values, so you can improve the reliability and validity of your priority setting by making sure that you do that values exercise first. So while we generally all have a sense of what's important to us in life, the one thing that I find that can be really useful, especially during a time of being overwhelmed, is to take a moment to consider at one time what all the different primary areas of my life are. And this is another thing that people rarely, if ever, do. So I recommend making a list of around 10 or so of the most important domains in your life. Things like family, work, health, community, whatever's important to you. And you don't want to make it too big. I'd try to narrow it, to about 10 so that it's just a manageable thing to see and really behold and comprehend. So these are mine. These are the 10 most important areas in my life. And yours might be slightly different. You may have things on there like leadership or creativity or parenting may not be on your list. I find that in this exercise that it's just really, really helpful and satisfying to sit back and look at my entire circle of life with all of its major components all at once in one place. It brings me or allows me kind of a perspective taking that I don't often get in my life. And once you do that, then you're in a really good position to do the next step. And the next step that I find is really, really helpful here is to pull out your top 3. And you want to make sure that you do this in a very guilt-free, nobody's looking kind of way. And remember that just because something doesn't make your number 1, 2, or 3, doesn't mean that it's not vitally, vitally important to you. You just want to ask yourself the harmless question, which of these 3 areas matter the most to me right now? And the key is that you're not asking yourself to make a permanent commitment. It's about right now. It may seem like we're splitting hairs here, but we're really not. It's my top 3 priorities in life that are constantly colliding with each other. So it's immensely helpful for me to know, that when push comes to shove, which domain trumps another. And if you had to choose, is it spirituality or is it personal health that's the most important to you? Or is it your work or maybe your family? Knowing where you stand on the big topics is extremely illuminating, both for understanding how you tick, but also for guidance when it comes to making choices. For example, if you're trying to make a tough decision between attending a back-to-school night for your kid or conducting a really important client session, it helps to know where your priorities are landing. And it may be that you're in a phase where your professional life needs your full attention and you need to be putting that first for a period of time, or vice versa. The important thing to recognize here is that we can't have several number 1 priorities at the same time. Multiple top priorities are, simply put, just poorly thought out priorities. So if you only get this far and that's all that you do, and you know your top values, your top 3 values, and your top 3 priorities, then that's huge and you're doing great. But for me, I like to go deeper. It's not quite enough. I want to know specifically what matters to me the most in each primary domain of my life. Because really, when you think about it, our values and priorities for things like work and parenting, for example, can look very, very different. So I recommend that you take some time to look at all of the domains of your life that you created in that circle. If you're up for doing this, digging a little bit deeper and trying to answer the question, what are the things that matter the most to me, either in my marriage or in my financial world or in my relationship to my body, etc. Whatever it is that you've considered as primary domains in your life. And if you do decide to do this, I promise you it'll be so rewarding. What you'll end up with is this really well thought out, comprehensive belief system in writing that reflects your true nature and can become a roadmap of your true intentions for your life. This exercise has become a yearly ritual for me that I do on New Year's Day and really look forward to each year. And every year, those pages in my journal that I add to become like a sacred text to me that I refer back to over and over and constantly modify. So here's a little bit of an example, as you can see here in this slide, of some of the things that matter the most to me in the top areas of my life. And one of the ways that I use this, for example, just along the way, as I've considered different job opportunities, it's been really, really helpful for me to know that my top priorities when it comes to work are autonomy, the ability to touch people's lives, and the need to have creative expression. Knowing those 3 things has made it really, really clear to me like what kind of work would or wouldn't be satisfying. So I highly recommend you do that. But like I said, it's kind of an extra credit thing. What I'd like to do right now is zero in on one of the domains of life that a lot of people are finding particularly challenging right now. And that's the area of self-care. So I want to talk briefly about the ways that we can gain clarity in this arena. One of the problems with this topic that really bugs me is that it just gets way too broad. There are so many things that qualify as self-care that we could or should be doing, and particularly right now of all times, like from doing Zoom yoga to taking walks every evening, and making ourselves homemade nutritious meals, and we're gardening and growing our own vegetables. It just goes on forever. So when it comes to the area of self-care, I find that it's far more effective and helpful to think incredibly narrowly and think about what your absolute minimum non-negotiable fundamentals of self-care are. For me, this is the only thing that's ever worked. So what I mean by this is that I'm going to ask you to think about the three things, or it doesn't have to be three. I just tend to think in threes, that you are worthless to anyone without. For me, that's sleep, hydration, and sensible nutrition. And how to enact those things once you figure them out. The next question really, is how do you reliably achieve your self-care fundamentals? The answer really, I have found, is first of all, creating micro, tiny goals. The research has shown that it's so much easier to achieve small, incremental, almost laughable goals versus maintaining the status quo, due to some quirk in the way that our brain interprets and evaluates goals. So for me, my goals related to those three things I mentioned are in bed by 10 p.m., 1 glass of water every morning, and 1 meal a day that I'm proud of. That's it. Those are things that I can actually do. And as small as they might seem, these small acts can represent a mighty symbolic gesture that can keep that psychological door of awareness open so that you don't ever completely lose touch with those needs. So if you can establish your absolute bare minimum, then anything else that you do is a bonus. The next step is trying to install these as daily habits so that they become automatic. You really want to make them non-negotiable so that you don't have to put any energy or thought into them. They just happen. There's a saying around commitment that 99% commitment is a bitch, but 100% is a breeze. And it's really, really true when it comes to self-care fundamentals. You want to just set that aside and focus on other things, but know that the basics are being taken care of. And lastly, if you can tie these acts to your values, then your why becomes so much more powerful and inherently self-reinforcing. So let's stop and consider for just a second how we bring this all together. I'm a big, big believer in the power of putting things in context. So when you just think back for a minute on everything that we just talked about, honing in on your top 3 values and your top 3 priorities and your top 3 domains in life and the bare minimum non-negotiable self-care fundamentals. If you take an opportunity to look at that all together and ideally write it down and put it on a piece of paper like the ultimate cheat sheet, you have this amazing opportunity to just consider your whole life in context and to be able to consider any decisions that you're facing in the greater context without being overwhelmed. This is not an overwhelming list of things to look at. It's sort of a very distilled, very boiled down list of the essentials. And when you take a moment to actually consider everything together, all of these major components, you can start to see the relationships between them all, and perhaps begin to start asking yourself questions like, how is this time and this challenge an opportunity to maybe put my family first? Or how is this an opportunity to be of service right now, or to support my partner? Or maybe you can suddenly see how one of your challenges trumps everything else, like the need for personal safety or protecting your health. So I highly, highly recommend taking a moment to really try to bring it all together. So far, I know I've guided you through tons of list making exercises, and I've definitely been accused of being crazy about lists, which is true. I stand accused. But if you're not a list making person, or you want to find another great way to deepen these practices, I recommend that you try affirming your values out loud. The research actually on acceptance and commitment therapy shows that when you affirm your values or share them with somebody, that it's a really helpful part of internalizing them. I had the fun opportunity to talk with a bunch of students and alumni and ask them to, and faculty actually, and ask them to share or answer this question: what are the most important values related to being a psychologist? And they had some really amazing answers. I don't think you can see it on the screen, but I'll read a few of them to you. So Serena Castro, an alum, said, a non-pathologizing, compassionate stance towards my clients, and being in touch with my own humanity and vulnerabilities, or lifelong learning and growth. And Jeremy Bornstein, another alum, said, having a shared commitment to the work and feeling like we're making a difference, or being honest and transparent in our relationships. Ricardo Munoz, a recent webinar speaker and alum, said his top values were helping others and using evidence-based methods to do so, or sharing what I know with as many people as possible. Diane Raleigh, another alum, said honesty and empowering clients, and emphasizing providing service to all who are in need over money. I love that one. And Ketrin Hodges, a current student, said, achieving self-awareness through the therapeutic process and ethical decision-making and multicultural sensitivity. So technically this was still list making because people sent me emails and texts. However, these exchanges were deeply touching between me and these folks. And even though I've known some of these people for a long time and talked to them regularly, our relationship went a little bit deeper, and I felt like I got to know them a little bit better by sharing our values. You know, sharing your values with somebody else and out loud can be a beautifully vulnerable, mutually beneficial experience. So a couple ways to do this are you can consider doing some collaborative family priority setting. You know, that's one way to kind of reduce conflict in the household. Or you might want to just do some value sharing with your partner, just as a way to increase empathy. You know, any chance that you can get to speak your values out loud or share them with another is a chance that you're really deepening them and taking them to the next level. So the final step here is practicing alignment. And this is where the rubber meets the road. It's beyond, a little bit beyond the scope of this discussion to consider all the ways that we can overcome the challenges to alignment. But I do want to share one simple technique for me that's been the most effective. It's a mindfulness exercise that emphasizes the power of intention plus attention. And it's super simple. So all you need to do is take 5 minutes every morning to just mindfully reflect on your plans for the day. And I'm not talking about making a to-do list or anything like that. Just from a distance, just observe what your intentions and plans are for the day. And if you can, at the same time, take a moment to glance over your top values and priorities. And just imagine how you might be able to honor those values and priorities during the day. And it's okay if it's not immediately obvious or if it seems like there's no opportunity for that. The point is that you're staying open to the possibilities and you're keeping your values and your priorities top of mind. And then at the end of the day, you do the same thing. You just simply take 5 minutes before you go to bed and non-judgmentally, you just review your day and you just consider, how did it go? And then you consider how you might course correct for the next day. And that's it. Intention and attention are really the wings of awareness. And it's that accumulation of awareness, bit by bit, that ultimately leads to rock solid clarity and that peace of mind that we're all seeking. So if you'd like to learn more about my work or about this topic, please check out my TED Talk online or visit my website at KristineKlussman.com. And I think we have some time. Yeah, I think we're doing okay. So I'd love to just take a moment to answer a few questions if I can figure out how to do that. So let's see. I've got a couple questions here. Okay, so going back to the matrix slide on self-care, values, and priorities in self-care, those 4 things, is that something that you recommend we write down? And if so, what would that look like? Great question. Thank you for asking that. Yes, I absolutely recommend that you would write that down. And, ordinarily, what I would be asking or thinking about writing down or making sure that you would have handy, what I would recommend is just 2 things, the values and the priorities. And that's a reasonable thing that most people can keep kind of top of mind or keep on their phone. But just given how we're going through this period of overwhelm and this global pandemic, and that we're all experiencing so many challenges to self-care, I added those other 2, to kind of create that 4-quadrant matrix. And I think it's really important that, we can look at all of that together and consider, it's not asking too much to just consider a few things in each of those categories, and they're each such important categories. So I definitely recommend writing it down. We can't, it's really the biggest obstacle, as I was saying before, to connecting with our values and priorities is remembering them. We just don't have them top of mind. And you don't want to try to remember too many either. So get your list as small as possible and then keep them with you somewhere, somehow, so that you can stay connected to them. All right, thank you. I'm going to look at the next question. Okay, so the next question is, are you saying that all of your decisions are supposed to follow this ranking system? That's a great question. I'm glad that got asked. Absolutely not. We're not robots, and we're not seeking perfection by any means. In some of those exercises where we were looking at the circle of your life, and where I asked you to rank the top 3 areas of your life to help guide your decision making. The point of that is so that you can just be more conscious and aware when you are and when you are not in alignment with your priorities. It's absolutely fine to consciously step aside from your priorities, but the point is that just to bring some more consciousness to all of that. So yeah, it's not trying to impose some formal high standard by any means. And then let me take one last question here. How do you remember all of this? That's a great question. And kind of similar to that first question. I think that, attention management is key here. So what I would suggest first is really, again, prioritizing what you're prioritizing about your values and priorities. And I would suggest that the number one thing that you go back to is those top 3 values. To me, that's the core of everything. And then the second most important thing is the top 3 priorities in my life. And as I said before, halfway through the presentation, if that's it, if that's all that you do or remember, you are so armed and dangerous to be making really well-guided decisions. Just this morning, my oldest wanted to interrupt me to have a game of ping pong while I was putting the final finishing touches on my presentation. And I was also supposed to go for my morning run. And it was, I didn't want to play that game of ping pong and I didn't want to be interrupted, but it was really helpful to just quickly flash on my top 3 areas of my life and my priorities, which, right now are number 1, parenting, and then work, and then health. Not everybody would agree with that, but that's what's important to me in that order right now. So I did go ahead and play that game of ping pong, and I skipped the run, and then I came back to working on my presentation. And it's amazing how that just knowing those 3 priorities even just helps me in those little micro decisions know that I'm on track and I'm making decisions on purpose, not just haphazardly. All right, and then let me take one more question. I think we have one more minute. From Tanya, any tips on being self-connected when there are so many worries about the world and about humanity during COVID-19? Oh, okay, that's a huge topic, and which I would love to go deeply into. Honestly, I could talk hours and hours about this topic, but really, we've actually been talking about it for the last hour. I have not found a better way to feel more connected to myself than by honing in on my values and my priorities. When I take the time to make those lists, that circle of life, or to just look at even just what my top 3 values are, forget about the whole, everything else, I feel instantly much more connected to myself. And people that I work with say the same thing as well when we do this kind of work in workshops. So I think this is the super highway way to get more connected to yourself, is to spend some time with your values and your priorities, and spend some time like considering what the big areas of your life are and the big challenges that you're dealing with. And you come away from that feeling grounded and oriented and like you have a frame of reference. And it really is the opposite of how we feel when we're disconnected and we're sort of just floating in orbit or just being reactive. So thanks for asking that question and all of those questions. On my website, you'll actually find, let's see if I can get to that next slide. Okay, so on the website, you'll find a lot more, several related research articles and blog posts on the same topic if you're interested in. And please reach out to me directly if you have any questions that I didn't answer today. I'd love to hear from you just in terms of how these exercises go. And I'd be happy to send you any of those instructions for the exercises that we did along with that list of values. So if you're interested in that, just shoot me an email and I'll send that over to you. And I also have a book coming out early next year in case you want to know more than you ever wanted to know about these topics. So you can check that out. And just lastly, a reminder to the student body. I'm also part of the team of alumni who are right now offering brief pro bono teletherapy to the Palo Alto University student body during COVID. So feel free to reach out in case you want to work with me one-on-one to hone in on some of these practices. And thank you again, everybody. It's been an honor to spend time with you today. Stay safe and please stay connected.